Ladies and gentlemen, the year 2017 will be quite important in terms of economic policy. We have general elections in the UK, in France, in Germany and in other countries. So it is important to understand what is at stake, and it is also important to identify, let's say, some of the key policy options that would be helpful and useful, and also to identify what I think is not acceptable. So when it comes to Germany's high current account surpluses, I think that's not much of a problem in a transatlantic perspective, because here one would rather look at the current account position of the Eurozone, and there is a relatively small current account surplus. But the German current account position is a problem within the EU, because we have this upper limit of 6% of GDP, and Germany has been above this limit since 2011, and nothing has happened to correct this. The Minister of Finance kind of refuses to do anything, says he can't do anything. That's not true. He could easily reduce the value-added tax rates, and this would reduce the net exports GDP ratio. The second point is that we are heading towards the G20 meeting in Hamburg, and I think it would be very important to put the issue of the topic of a minimum taxation on income on the agenda. I think it is naive to think that we will have sustainable globalization, the rule of law and democracy, if it cannot be assured that a modern government finds adequate financial resources. In a globalized world, we have some global common goods. Think of the climate protection, think about free trade in goods and services, and so on. And we cannot invest in these fields and in other important areas if we do not have adequate tax revenues. So minimum taxation at the international level should become a topic. I think it's also very important that we focus critically on the topic of minimum wages. There is a big problem, has been a big problem in France for many years. In France, the minimum wage currently is close to 10 euro per hour. This is way too high. And one can easily understand that it is too high if you consider that President Hollande had implemented subsidies for those firms which have employed workers getting the minimum wage. So roughly 1% of GDP was devoted to subsidization here. 1% is an enormous amount of money. It's roughly half the French R&D budget. And if we consider the fact that effectively it adds to the government deficit, and if we assume that France will have a permanent growth rate of 1.5% of output, it would lead to a long-term debt GDP ratio of 67% just from subsidization of the minimum wage. So this is extremely dangerous with this national minimum wage in a period of internet-based Islamistic radicalization. It is a deadly risk for France and its neighbor countries, and therefore everybody in Europe should be interested that France makes progress here. So France is as big as 4 or 5 US states. So I would say I'm not against minimum wages, but minimum wages should have a regional component, so should not be a national uniform minimum wage. And here we should see progress, hopefully relatively quickly. I hope also that we will see a better cooperation between Germany and France, and actually a deepening of the Eurozone. Finally, as regards Greece, I think it's irresponsible to impose effectively on Greece that there would be another cut of pensions, in this case of 18% in the year 2019. Greece has witnessed 3 rounds of big cuts in pensions, and I think it's absolutely irresponsible and unrealistic to impose an 18% cut on pensions of people who are often fairly poor. This will drive Greece into a desperate situation and further radicalization. Greece has gone through 7 years of a recession. Much of it is its own responsibility, and the Tsipras government, I find, is rather unprofessional in the field of economic policy reforms, but one can do much better. And there is a kind of a joint responsibility, and if the Eurozone is not able to cope with a relatively small country and its problems, to sort out the problems quickly, then the Eurozone in the end can do nothing. Then there will be further EU disintegration, so not just one Brexit, but many. And I think time is running out. The longest recession so far in Western history has been the United States in the 1930s, 4 consecutive years of a recession. And to allow Greece to fall into a 7-year-long recession, I mean, this is a disaster. It destroys the political system, political and economic stability, and is, I would say, largely irresponsible. So it's not always the case that reforms have enormous costs. So Greece needs reform of its constitution. Here we could involve the Venice Group, which is a group of legal experts from the Europe Council, and one should not be pessimistic, but one has to work on these problems seriously and also fairly quickly.